Let's get started. Story number 1.
The rain was relentless, a steady downpour that turned the cobblestone streets of the small village into rivers of glistening water. Emily pulled her coat tighter around herself as she hurried up the hill toward the church. It loomed above the village like a silent sentinel, its spire piercing the dark, brooding sky. She had been sent by Father Grayson to retrieve an old ledger from the rectory. The church's history fascinated her, and despite the eerie atmosphere, she was eager to explore its secrets. Pushing open the heavy oak door, she was met with the musty smell of old wood and incense. The church was silent except for the occasional creak of the rafters as the wind howled outside. Emily had always found solace in the church's beauty, the stained glass windows casting vibrant colors, the carved pews worn smooth by centuries of worship. But tonight something felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. She made her way to the rectory, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The ledger was supposed to be in a locked cabinet in Father Grayson's office. As she reached for the door, a chill ran down her spine, and she hesitated. The air felt heavier here, as if the walls themselves were watching her. Shaking off the unease, she stepped inside and turned on the desk lamp. The soft, yellow light illuminated the room, revealing shelves lined with ancient books and artifacts. Emily found the cabinet easily and was surprised to find it unlocked. Inside, among stacks of parchment and books, lay the ledger. She pulled it out carefully, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. As she flipped through its pages, she noticed something odd. Some entries were written in a language she didn't recognize, and others described rituals and ceremonies she'd never heard of. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the words scrawled across the pages as if written in haste or panic. A sudden thud from above made her jump, nearly dropping the ledger. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound had come from the bell tower. No one else was supposed to be in the church. Gathering her courage, she decided to investigate. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to the sound, as if something or someone was calling her. The staircase to the bell tower was narrow and steep, spiraling upward into darkness. Emily's flashlight flickered as she climbed, the beam barely piercing the shadows. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint sound of whispering reached her ears. It wasn't the wind, it was low and deliberate, like voices murmuring just out of reach. When she reached the top, the whispering stopped. The bell tower was empty, its stone walls bare except for a rusted iron bell hanging overhead. Emily shivered as she stepped forward, her breath visible in the icy air. Something caught her eye, a small, carved figure lying on the floor. She picked it up, noting its strange design. It was a crude representation of a person, but its face was distorted, twisted into an expression of agony. Suddenly, the bell above her began to swing, its deep, resonant toll reverberating through the tower. Emily dropped the figure and stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the floor. She looked around frantically, but saw no one. The bell stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. She grabbed her flashlight and hurried down the stairs, the sense of being watched growing stronger with every step. When she reached the main hall, she stopped short. The church was no longer empty. Figures stood in the pews, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move or speak, but their presence was undeniable. "Who's there?" Emily's voice trembled as she stepped back toward the door. The figures remained silent, their heads turning in unison to follow her movements. Panic set in, and she turned to run, but the heavy door wouldn't budge. She pounded on it, desperate to escape, but it was as if the church itself was holding her captive. A low, guttural voice echoed through the hall, speaking in the same strange language she had seen in the ledger. Emily turned to face the figures, her back pressed against the door. One by one, they began to step forward, their movements slow and deliberate. As they came into the light, she saw that their faces were not obscured by shadows, but by something else, something unnatural. Their eyes were hollow, their skin pale and translucent, as if they weren't fully part of this world. The voice grew louder, the words seeming to vibrate in her chest. Emily clutched the cross around her neck, whispering a prayer. The figures stopped, their hollow eyes fixed on her. For a moment, the voice paused, and the church fell silent again. Then the stained glass windows shattered, the sound deafening. A cold wind rushed through the church, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. Emily screamed as the figures closed in, their twisted faces inches from hers. Just as she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, a blinding light filled the room. The figures recoiled, hissing and writhing as they dissolved into shadows. Emily turned to see Father Grayson standing at the entrance, a crucifix in his hand and a look of grim determination on his face. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Emily didn't need to be told twice. She ran past him and into the rain-soaked night, not stopping until she reached her home. The next day, the church stood silent and empty, its doors locked and its windows boarded up. Father Grayson refused to speak of what had happened, but Emily couldn't forget the twisted faces or the voice that had called to her. The ledger was gone, and no one knew where it had come from, or where it had gone. Years later, the church was demolished, its stones repurposed for a new building. But locals still spoke of the night the church came alive, of the figures that watched from the pews, and of the bell that tolled on its own. And sometimes, on stormy nights, they claimed to hear whispers coming from the hill where the church once stood. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The church had stood in the village for over 200 years, its spire rising above the town like a silent sentinel, watching over the streets and fields below. It was a beautiful building, with tall, arched windows, intricately carved wooden pews, and an altar that gleamed with age and reverence. Despite its grandeur, the church had been largely abandoned. The village had grown smaller over the years, and the few remaining villagers had stopped attending services long ago. Some said the church was haunted, but no one would speak openly about it. They all knew better than to stir the old spirits that rested there. Alex had recently moved to the village. He was a young man, new to the area, and eager to explore the countryside. The village was quiet, serene, with no hustle and bustle of city life. He had heard the rumors about the church, of course. Everyone had. But being a man of reason and logic, he dismissed them as just that. Rumors. He didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of the supernatural nonsense people whispered about in the pubs. He was a skeptic, and as such, he decided that the church would be his first destination for exploration. One chilly autumn evening, when the sun had long since disappeared behind the hills, Alex decided to venture into the church. The villagers had warned him not to go after dark, but that only intrigued him more. The thought of a haunted church seemed like the perfect challenge. Armed with only a flashlight and his curiosity, he made his way toward the building. The wind howled as it passed through the trees, shaking the branches above him. The church came into view, its silhouette stark against the dimming sky. The old wooden door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as if inviting him inside. He pushed the door open, the ancient wood groaning in protest, and stepped into the church. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the stone walls, amplified in the vast emptiness. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of moonlight that filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn pews. The air smelled of age, of something long forgotten, and it sent a shiver up Alex's spine. But he brushed it off. It was just a building, after all. He wandered through the rows of pews, examining the fine details of the architecture. His flashlight flickered occasionally, but he assumed it was just a fault in the batteries. He made his way toward the altar, his curiosity piqued by the large wooden door at the back of the church, partially hidden behind the heavy curtains of ivy. He was drawn to it. Pushing the ivy aside, he found the door to be slightly ajar as well. The air beyond it was cold, and the chill sent a shiver through his bones. He hesitated for a moment, but then, against his better judgment, he stepped through. The room beyond was small, a narrow stone staircase leading downward into the darkness. Alex felt his heart rate quicken. He had not expected this. He had heard no mention of hidden rooms or crypts. The villagers hadn't said anything about this part of the church. He felt an unexplainable urge to explore, to see where the staircase led. The rational part of his mind warned him to leave, but the excitement of discovery overpowered it. His flashlight illuminated the narrow path, the cold air growing more intense as he descended. The staircase was steep, the stone steps worn from centuries of use. He descended slowly, the darkness swallowing him up as the light from above faded. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, stone-walled chamber. The air was thick with the scent of dampness and decay, and the floor was covered in a layer of dust. There was a small altar in the center of the room, its surface covered with old faded candles and dried flowers. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves filled with various relics and objects, but what caught his attention was a large wooden chest in the corner of the room. It looked old, its surface worn and cracked with age. His curiosity got the better of him again. He approached the chest cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He knelt down and gently placed his hand on the lid. It was cold to the touch, and as he lifted it, a sudden gust of air blew through the room, sending a chill down his spine. Inside the chest was a collection of old yellowed papers and a strange, leather-bound book. The pages of the book were brittle, the ink faded from years of neglect. But Alex's eyes were drawn to the symbols etched into the cover. He picked the book up gingerly, feeling its weight in his hands. The pages rustled as he flipped through them, the words foreign and ancient. His eyes scanned the strange symbols, and his stomach turned as a sense of unease washed over him. There was something about this book, something he couldn't quite place. As he turned to the last page, a word caught his eye. Vitae. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Alex felt his breath catch in his throat as a feeling of dread washed over him. His heart raced, and his flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. He looked around the room, his skin crawling as he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He wasn't alone. A soft sound, like the rustling of fabric, echoed from behind him. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the walls, the chest, the altar. But something was different. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the whispering began, low and unintelligible. The sounds seemed to come from all around him, swirling like a distant chant. His heart hammered in his chest as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. He backed away from the chest, his mind racing. The door to the chamber, the only way out, was across the room. He took a step toward it, but his body froze as a cold, clammy hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating a figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood, but there was something unsettling about the way it stood, motionless, watching him. The air around it seemed to shimmer, and the whispering grew louder as though the figure was speaking, though its lips didn't move. Leave. Now. Alex's breath came in ragged gasps. The figure took a step forward, and Alex stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose stone. He fell to the ground, scrambling to get to his feet, his flashlight falling from his hands and rolling across the floor, casting wild shadows as it spun. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. Alex could hear its raspy breath, could feel the cold emanating from it like an ice storm. He scrambled toward the door, his hands shaking as he reached for the handle. He wrenched it open with all his strength, stumbling into the staircase, not daring to look back. He ran up the stairs, his heart thundering in his chest, his legs shaking beneath him. The whispering had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like the room itself was closing in on him. He burst into the main church, the door slamming shut behind him with a loud bang. The silence in the church was deafening, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Alex didn't stop to look around. He ran out of the church and into the cold night air, gasping for breath, the shadows of the trees closing in around him. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but no explanation seemed possible. He didn't know how long he stood there in the cold, trying to steady his breathing, but eventually he turned and left, not looking back. The next morning, Alex packed his things and left the village. He never spoke to anyone about what he had encountered in the church, and he never returned. He couldn't. The memory of that cold touch, the whispers, the figure, none of it made sense, and yet he knew what he had felt. St. Anne's Church remained standing, its doors creaking open only on rare occasions. The village moved on, life continuing as usual, but the whispers of that dark place never quite went away. Alex had learned one thing that night. Some places are best left undisturbed, no matter how tempting they may seem. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain lashed against the windows of St. Catherine's Church, a structure that had stood for nearly 3 centuries on the edge of the small, isolated village. Its Gothic spire rose into the sky like a finger pointing toward heaven, or warning of something darker. For most of its existence, St. Catherine's had been a beacon of faith and community, but now few dared to step foot inside, especially after sunset. Lydia never believed the stories about the church. She had moved to the village 2 years ago, an outsider trying to find peace after a painful divorce. The whispers about St. Catherine's amused her more than anything else. Tales of ghostly monks, candles lighting themselves, and the bell tolling on its own. She dismissed it as the kind of folklore small towns love to cling to. It wasn't until the evening of the village's annual autumn festival that Lydia had her first real encounter with the church's darker side. She had volunteered to help Father Hargrove clean up after the festivities, a task that seemed straightforward enough. The priest was a kind but reserved man in his late 50s, with tired eyes and a quiet demeanor that made him seem older than his years. Lydia found him endearing, if a bit distant. As the festival wound down and the villagers drifted home, Father Hargrove handed her a ring of keys. "There's an old storage room beneath the chapel," he said. "We keep extra decorations and supplies there. Would you mind bringing up the remaining boxes? I'll lock up once you're done." Lydia nodded and took the keys. She made her way into the church, its interior dimly lit by flickering candles. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of wax and incense. The storage room was located down a narrow staircase at the back of the chapel. As she descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and she felt an inexplicable heaviness settle over her. The storage room itself was unremarkable. Stone walls, wooden shelves lined with old hymnals, and dusty boxes filled with holiday decorations. Lydia found the boxes Father Hargrove had mentioned and began stacking them by the stairs. It was then that she noticed the door. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by a pile of broken chairs, was a heavy wooden door with iron hinges. It looked older than the rest of the church, its surface scarred and weathered. Something about it made her pause. She had never noticed this door before, though she had been in the church several times. Curiosity got the better of her, and she moved the chairs aside to get a closer look. The door had no handle, only a keyhole set into the iron plate. Her fingers brushed against the keyring Father Hargrove had given her. "Just a peek," she whispered to herself, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow stone passageway. The air inside was damp and carried a metallic tang, like old blood. A faint sound reached her ears. Was it whispering? It was so soft she couldn't be sure if she was hearing it or imagining it. Against her better judgment, Lydia stepped inside. The passageway sloped downward, the walls lined with niches that held long extinguished lanterns. As she moved deeper, the whispers grew louder, though she still couldn't make out the words. It felt like dozens of voices speaking at once, layered and overlapping. At the end of the passage, she entered a circular chamber. In the center was a stone altar, its surface stained dark. Surrounding it were ancient carvings that depicted scenes she couldn't understand, figures kneeling before shadowy forms, hands raised in supplication or fear. A chill ran through her as she realized the whispers had stopped. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her ears like a physical force. She turned to leave, her heart pounding, but froze when she saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. His robes were tattered and his face was obscured by a hood. He stood perfectly still, blocking her only exit. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she backed away from him, her mind racing. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand, and the whispers began again, louder this time. They weren't coming from him, but from the walls themselves, the very stones vibrating with the sound. Panicking, Lydia bolted toward the doorway, shoving past the figure. For a moment, she felt an icy grip on her arm, but she wrenched free and sprinted up the passageway. The whispers followed her, growing into a cacophony of screams. When she reached the storage room, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. She collapsed against the stairs, gasping for air, her body trembling. Father Hargrove found her there minutes later, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She tried to explain what had happened, but he only shook his head, a grim expression on his face. "You shouldn't have opened that door," he said quietly. Lydia stared at him, her fear giving way to anger. "What's down there? What is this place?" He hesitated before answering. The church was built on the site of something older, something dark. The altar beneath the chapel was used for rituals, ones that have no place in God's house. We sealed it off long ago, but the past doesn't always stay buried. Lydia never returned to St. Bede's, Catherine's after that night. She moved away from the village within a month, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched, even in her own home. The church still stands, though the villagers avoid it more than ever. Some say the bell rings on its own late at night, even though the rope has long since rotted away. Others claim to hear whispers when they pass by, soft voices calling their names. And on rare occasions, someone spots a figure in tattered robes standing in the shadows, watching and waiting. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The church of St. Bartholomew stood at the edge of a crumbling cliff overlooking the sea. It had weathered centuries of storms, wars, and neglect. Though its Gothic spire was still a landmark for sailors, the church itself had fallen into disuse. Services had ceased decades ago, the congregation dwindling to none, and the once grand structure now lay in silence. Its stained glass windows broken, its pews coated in dust. Local legend whispered of strange occurrences in the church. Candles lighting themselves, the sound of organ music in the dead of night, and a shadowy figure that roamed the aisles. Few dared to enter the church after sunset. But to Adam, a history student with a passion for uncovering forgotten stories, these tales were more intriguing than frightening. Adam arrived at St. Bartholomew's on a cold October afternoon, his backpack filled with notebooks, a camera, and a flashlight. He had been researching the church for weeks, fascinated by its history. Built in the 14th century, it had once been a place of pilgrimage, famous for its supposed healing relic, a fragment of cloth said to belong to a saint. But as time passed, the relic disappeared, and rumors of heretical practices began to circulate. Some said the clergy had turned to darker rituals, invoking powers that should never have been called upon. The church was eventually abandoned, left to decay under the weight of its secrets. As Adam pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a gust of cold air greeted him. The interior was dim, the remaining light filtering through the broken windows in fractured patterns. The faint scent of mildew hung in the air. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the stone floor. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs. Adam set up his camera on a tripod, aiming it toward the altar. The intricate carvings of angels and saints had eroded over time, their faces blurred and indistinct. He began to take photographs, noting the strange symbols etched into the stone, a mix of Christian iconography and something else, something older and more unsettling. As he examined the carvings, he felt a sudden chill, as though a draft had swept through the church. Turning, he saw nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Shrugging it off, he continued his work, his curiosity outweighing his unease. In the far corner of the church, near a crumbling confessional, Adam discovered a staircase leading downward. It was narrow and steep, the steps worn smooth by centuries of use. He hesitated. This was what he had been hoping for, a hidden crypt or storage room that might hold clues to the church's mysterious past. Gripping his flashlight, he descended. The air grew colder as he went deeper, the faint smell of damp earth mingling with something metallic. The stairs ended in a small stone chamber. At its center was a simple wooden table, its surface blackened with age. Surrounding it were more carvings, these far more elaborate and unsettling. Figures with distorted faces knelt in worship before a towering, shapeless form. Adam's pulse quickened as he photographed the images. This wasn't part of any Christian tradition he knew. It felt ancient, primal. A soft sound broke the silence, a whisper. Adam froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He scanned the room with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. He convinced himself it was the wind or his imagination. Yet, as he turned back to the table, the whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't in English or any language he recognized, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, urgent murmur, as if someone or something was speaking directly to him. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. The whisper ceased. replaced by an oppressive silence. He swallowed hard, his courage beginning to waver. As much as he wanted to uncover the church's secrets, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of doubt on him. He turned to leave, but as he did, the door to the crypt slammed shut with a deafening crash. Panic surged through him as he rushed to the door, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing around the chamber. They seemed to come from the very walls surrounding him, growing into a chaotic cacophony that made his head spin. Adam backed away from the door, his flashlight flickering. In its weak beam, he saw a shadow move across the wall. It wasn't his. The shadow was tall, hunched, and unnaturally thin, its movements jerky and wrong. It seemed to seep out of the carvings themselves, a living embodiment of the grotesque figures etched into the stone. "Who's there?" Adam's voice cracked as he pressed himself against the wall. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it began to take form, stepping out of the wall as though it were emerging from water. It wasn't human. Its face was a void, featureless except for a wide, gaping mouth. It loomed over him, its presence suffocating, and the whispers intensified, each word drilling into his mind. Adam clutched the cross around his neck, muttering a prayer he barely remembered. The figure recoiled slightly at the sight of the cross, its form flickering like a dying flame. Summoning every ounce of courage, Adam pushed past the creature, slamming his shoulder against the door. It gave way, and he stumbled into the stairwell, his flashlight clattering to the ground. He didn't stop to retrieve it. He ran up the stairs, his breath ragged, the whispers chasing him like a tide. When he reached the main hall, the church was different. The air was thick with the scent of burning candles, though none were lit. The pews were filled, not with people, but with shadows, their forms indistinct but undeniably present. All their heads turned toward him as he bolted for the door. This time the door opened easily, and Adam burst into the open air, the sound of the waves and the wind a welcome relief. He didn't stop running until he was far from the church, his heart pounding and his mind racing. He didn't look back. Adam never returned to St. Bartholomew's, and he didn't share the full details of what he had experienced. The photos he had taken were too dark and blurred to reveal much, but he couldn't bring himself to delete them. They were a reminder of what he had seen, proof that it wasn't a dream or a hallucination. The church still stands, its spire a silent warning. Locals say that on stormy nights, the sound of whispers can be heard drifting on the wind, and a shadowy figure is sometimes seen watching from the broken windows. No one dares to enter anymore, not even the bravest of thrill-seekers. Whatever Adam encountered that day, it remains, waiting in the darkness beneath St. Bartholomew's, its whispers calling out to those who dare to listen. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The Church of St. Mary's stood in the heart of an old English village, its stone facade weathered by centuries of rain and wind. It was beautiful in its decay, a place where history seemed to hang heavy in the air. Tourists occasionally visited during the day, drawn by its medieval architecture and the faint echoes of hymns that seemed to linger in the high arched ceilings. But by night, the church stood abandoned, avoided even by the most daring of the locals. For years, rumors of hauntings had circulated. Parishioners swore they'd heard voices when no one was there, footsteps echoing down the aisles, and the mournful tolling of a bell long since removed from the bell tower. The church was still technically active, but the congregation had dwindled to a handful of elderly villagers who attended Sunday services out of habit rather than faith. Sam had moved to the village only a few months earlier. A writer by profession, he had come seeking solitude, hoping the quiet countryside would provide inspiration for his next novel. St. Mary's intrigued him from the start. He'd always been drawn to old churches, fascinated by their history and the layers of life and death they held within their walls. When he first mentioned his interest in St. Mary's at the local pub, the villagers fell silent. One of them, an elderly man named George, leaned in close and said, "If you've got any sense, lad, you'll leave that church alone." Sam laughed it off, thinking it was just local superstition. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts, and the idea of an old church being haunted seemed like the perfect premise for his next book. Despite the warnings, he decided to visit the church one evening, just before sunset, when the light was low and golden. The air was crisp as he walked through the graveyard that surrounded the church. Moss-covered headstones jutted out of the ground at odd angles, their inscriptions faded with age. The church door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty nave. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and aged wood. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fragmented colors onto the dusty floor. Sam wandered the aisles, taking in the details. The intricately carved pulpit, the ancient wooden pews, and the worn stone steps leading to the altar. It wasn't long before he felt it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the weight of unseen eyes upon him. He paused, listening. The church was silent save for the faint creak of the wooden beams overhead. Dismissing the feeling as his imagination, he continued exploring, his footsteps echoing softly. In one corner of the church, he found a small door, partially hidden behind an old tapestry. It was locked, but the rusted key still hung on a nearby hook. Curiosity piqued, Sam turned the key and opened the door to reveal a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The stairs led to the crypt, a cold, dark space lit only by the dim beam of his flashlight. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint metallic scent of decay. Stone coffins lined the walls, their lids carved with the names and titles of those interred there. As he moved deeper into the crypt, he noticed a small alcove at the far end. Inside it stood a solitary coffin, smaller than the others and unmarked. Unlike the others, its lid was slightly askew. Sam hesitated, his pulse quickening. Something about this coffin felt wrong, out of place. The moment he stepped closer, the silence was broken by the faint sound of a woman's voice. It was soft and melodic, like a distant lullaby. He froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the confined space. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Sam's breath quickened as he backed away from the alcove, his instincts screaming at him to leave. As he turned to climb the stairs, he heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the stone steps behind him. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping the darkness, but there was no one there. "Is someone here?" he called, trying to keep his voice steady. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint, rasping whisper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. The air in the crypt grew colder, and Sam felt a deep, primal fear take hold of him. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. The church above was now shrouded in twilight, the stained glass windows casting dim, distorted shadows across the floor. As he made his way to the exit, the organ began to play, a low, mournful tune that filled the air with an unbearable sense of dread. Sam turned toward the organ loft, his heart pounding. There was no one there. The keys moved on their own, pressed by unseen hands. The music swelled, a chaotic, discordant melody that seemed to pierce straight into his mind. He ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him like a weight. Shadows began to move along the walls, coalescing into vague, human-like shapes. Their faces were indistinct, but their eyes glowed faintly, watching him. Desperate, Sam shouted, "What do you want from me?" The shadows didn't respond, but the organ music stopped abruptly, leaving the church in an oppressive silence. A single chilling word echoed through the nave, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave." The door behind him creaked open, and Sam didn't hesitate. He ran out into the night, the cool air stinging his lungs. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his cottage, slamming the door shut behind him. That night he barely slept, plagued by vivid nightmares of the crypt and the unmarked coffin. The whispers followed him into his dreams, their sinister words clawing at his sanity. The next morning he packed his belongings and left the village without saying goodbye. He never wrote about St. Mary's, never told anyone what he had experienced. But he couldn't forget the shadows, the music, and the voice that had commanded him to leave. Years later, he heard from a fellow writer that St. Mary's had been sealed off, the local authorities citing structural instability. But Sam knew the truth. The church wasn't abandoned. It had been left alone, just as it wanted. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The church was older than anyone in the village could remember. St. Harlow's, as it was called, sat at the edge of the woods, its stone walls weathered and scarred by time. The surrounding cemetery was crowded with crooked headstones, their inscriptions long eroded by wind and rain. For years, it had been abandoned, left to decay as the village dwindled. Yet no one spoke openly about the church. It wasn't just forgotten, it was avoided. Ellie had moved to the village a few months earlier. A freelance photographer, she had been drawn to the charm of the quiet countryside. Stumbling upon St. Harlow's during one of her walks had been a surprise. She hadn't expected something so strikingly eerie to exist just beyond the tree line. The church fascinated her. Its Gothic architecture was hauntingly beautiful, and there was a stillness to it that made the hair on her neck prickle. It seemed wrong that no one had tried to preserve it. Whenever she asked the locals about it, they grew uncomfortable, mumbling vague warnings about staying away. Ellie wasn't superstitious. She dismissed their reluctance as old-fashioned paranoia. That's why, one gray and overcast afternoon, she packed her camera and decided to explore St. Harlow's properly. The forest leading to the church was silent, except for the crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots. When she reached the clearing, the building loomed before her, its bell tower crooked, its stained glass cracked and missing pieces. The air felt heavier here, as though the woods held their breath. She pushed open the large wooden doors. They groaned loudly, revealing the shadowed interior. The light from outside filtered in weakly, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the air. The nave was lined with broken pews, and the altar at the far end was draped in tattered cloth. Ellie lifted her camera and began snapping pictures. She moved methodically, capturing the decay, the warped wood, the shattered windows, the eerie carvings of angels whose faces had eroded into featureless masks. Despite the church's desolation, it felt as though it were alive, watching her through unseen eyes. The sound of her footsteps echoed unnervingly, but she pressed on, climbing a narrow spiral staircase to the bell tower. At the top, the rusted bell hung silently, its clapper long gone. The view from the tower was breathtaking. The woods stretched endlessly, the village a distant speck. She turned to descend the stairs when a sound stopped her cold. It was faint, but unmistakable, the soft, mournful toll of a bell. Her heart thudded in her chest. She stood frozen, straining to listen. The bell rang again, louder this time, its deep resonance filling the air. But it wasn't coming from the tower, it was coming from below. She rushed down the stairs, her breath quick and shallow. When she reached the nave, she stopped, her blood running cold. The air had changed. It was colder, heavier. The faint smell of incense lingered, though no candles burned. And then she saw them. At first, they were barely more than shadows flickering at the edges of her vision. But as she stood frozen, they grew more distinct. Figures, hooded, robed, lined the pews. Their faces were hidden, their forms unnaturally still. "Hello?" Ellie's voice trembled, echoing through the church. The figures didn't respond. They remained silent, their heads turning slowly to face her. The oppressive silence was broken by a sound that sent chills down her spine, a whisper. It was soft at first, indistinct, but it grew louder, layered, as though 100 voices were speaking at once. She stumbled back, her camera slipping from her hands and clattering to the ground. The whispering became clearer, words forming in a language she didn't understand. Her chest tightened as she turned to flee, but the doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging the church into darkness. Her flashlight was still in her bag. With trembling hands, she fumbled for it, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. When she finally turned it on, the beam illuminated the nearest pew, and the figure sitting there. It wasn't human. The face beneath the hood was pale and stretched, the eyes hollow voids, the mouth unnaturally wide as though frozen in a silent scream. Its head tilted, and for a horrifying moment, it seemed to smile. Ellie screamed, backing away. The figures began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. She turned and ran toward the altar, desperate to find another way out. Behind the altar, she saw a door slightly ajar. Without thinking, she threw it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. The whispers were muffled now, but they didn't stop. She found herself in a narrow passage that led downward. The walls were damp, the air stifling. She had no choice but to follow the passage, her flashlight flickering as she moved. At the end of the passage was a crypt. The room was small, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Stone coffins lined the walls, their lids etched with the same strange symbols she'd seen in the church. In the center of the crypt stood a pedestal, and on it lay a book, bound in cracked, blackened leather. Ellie approached cautiously, the whispers louder here than ever. The book seemed to pulse with its own energy, the symbols on its cover glowing faintly in the dim light. Against her better judgment, she reached out and touched it. The instant her fingers brushed the leather, the room erupted in noise. The whispers turned into screams, and the crypt shook violently. Ellie fell to her knees, clutching her head as the voices filled her mind. Images flashed before her, rituals, blood, shadowy figures kneeling before something vast and formless. She scrambled to her feet and ran back up the passage, the screams chasing her. When she burst into the nave, the church was alive with movement. The figures were everywhere now, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The doors were still shut, but Ellie didn't care. She ran to them and threw herself against the wood, pounding desperately. To her shock, they opened easily, and she stumbled out into the cold evening air. The whispers stopped the moment she crossed the threshold. The church was silent again, its doors swinging shut behind her. Ellie didn't stop running until she reached the safety of her home. She locked the doors, drew the curtains, and sat trembling in the dark. The photos on her camera were corrupted, the files unreadable. She never spoke of what had happened to anyone, but she couldn't forget the feeling of those hollow eyes watching her. The villagers still refused to talk about St. Harlow's. On quiet nights, some claim to hear the faint tolling of its bell, though no one dares to investigate. The church stands empty, its secrets buried within its crumbling walls. But Ellie knows the truth. It isn't empty. It's waiting. Story. The end.
Story number 7.
The church stood at the edge of town, an ancient Gothic structure with soaring spires and stained glass windows that once glowed with ethereal light. But those windows had grown dark and dull over the years, the church falling into disrepair as the faithful dwindled. For decades, the building sat abandoned, a shell of its former glory, until a new pastor, Reverend Thomas Mercer, took it upon himself to restore the sacred space. Thomas was a man of conviction, young but determined, with a passion for reviving the town's waning faith. He moved into the small rectory beside the church and began the arduous task of cleaning and repairing the interior. The townsfolk whispered about his efforts, but kept their distance. The church had a reputation, one that no one dared to speak of outright. On his first night in the rectory, Thomas was awakened by the sound of faint whispers. At first, he thought it was the wind brushing against the cracked windows, but the voices grew more distinct. They were low and murmuring, as if a congregation was reciting a prayer just out of earshot. He dismissed it as his imagination, blaming the exhaustion from the day's work. But the whispers persisted. Each night, they grew louder. On the fourth night, as he lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, Thomas heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the church. The wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen visitors. Grabbing a flashlight, he ventured out into the chilly night and crossed the overgrown path to the church. Inside, the air was heavy and cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into his bones. The flashlight's beam swept across the pews, revealing dust motes dancing in the air. At the altar, the figure of Christ loomed, his face obscured by years of grime and neglect, but no one was there. Thomas sighed and turned to leave, but as he reached the door, the whispers returned. They came from behind him, from the altar. Slowly he turned back, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam landed on the pews, and his heart stopped. A shadow moved. No, several shadows. They slithered across the pews like smoke, coalescing near the altar. Thomas stood frozen, his breath hitching as the shadows began to take shape. They were figures, indistinct and dark, their forms flickering like candle flames. One of them turned toward him, and though it had no face, he felt its gaze pierce through him. He stumbled back, his voice caught in his throat. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of words he couldn't understand. In a moment of sheer panic, he fled, slamming the heavy church doors behind him. The next morning, Thomas convinced himself it had been a dream, a vivid, unsettling dream brought on by the church's eerie atmosphere. Determined to push forward, he continued his work. He scrubbed the floors, repaired the broken pews, and polished the tarnished brass candelabras. Yet, as he cleaned, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He often glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but there was never anyone there. One evening, as he was cataloging old hymnals in the vestry, He found a worn leather-bound journal tucked away in a dusty drawer. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten notes in a looping script. The journal belonged to Reverend Elias Grayson, a pastor who had served the church nearly a century earlier. Elias's entries began as mundane accounts of sermons and community events, but as Thomas read on, the tone shifted. The journal detailed strange occurrences: parishioners hearing whispers during Mass, candles extinguishing on their own, and an oppressive presence that seemed to linger in the church. Elias wrote of his growing fear and the discovery of something hidden beneath the church, something he called the Hollow Room. Thomas's curiosity got the better of him. That night, armed with a crowbar and a lantern, he ventured into the church's basement. It was a labyrinth of stone corridors, damp and reeking of mildew. At the far end of the basement, he found a trapdoor concealed beneath a rotting carpet. It took all his strength to pry it open. The air that escaped was foul, a mix of decay and earth. He descended the narrow staircase into the hollow room, his lantern casting long shadows on the stone walls. The room was small, no larger than a crypt, with strange symbols carved into the floor. At its center stood a stone pedestal, and atop it rested a tarnished chalice. As Thomas approached, the air grew heavier, pressing against his chest. He reached out to touch the chalice, but the moment his fingers brushed its surface, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They were deafening, echoing off the walls. He staggered back as the shadows began to seep from the corners of the room, swirling around him. The whispers formed words now, a single chilling phrase repeated over and over: "Leave this place." Thomas fled, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. He barely made it out of the basement before the trapdoor slammed shut behind him, the force of it rattling the floorboards above. Shaken but alive, he stumbled back to the rectory, vowing to never return to the hollow room. But the church would not let him go. The next morning, as he stood in the rectory's small kitchen, he saw something move in the corner of his eye. Turning, he found the journal lying open on the table, though he was certain he had left it in the vestry. The pages flipped on their own, stopping on an entry dated the day Elias had disappeared. The words seemed to bleed off the page. "The shadows have claimed me. May God forgive what I have done." That night, the church came alive. The bell, long rusted and unused, began to toll. The windows rattled, and the whispers became a roar. Thomas stood in the rectory, paralyzed with fear, as the shadows crept beneath the door, seeping into the room. They enveloped him, pulling him toward the church. He fought, clawing at the walls, but the shadows were relentless. They dragged him through the night, through the heavy wooden doors of the church and down into the hollow room. The trapdoor slammed shut above him, and the whispers fell silent. The townsfolk found the rectory empty the next morning. The church bell no longer rang, and the whispers ceased. Reverend Thomas Mercer had vanished, just as Elias Grayson had nearly a century before. To this day, no one dares to enter the church. Its doors remain locked, and the townsfolk avoid it at all costs. But on quiet nights, when the wind is still, some claim they can hear the faint tolling of the bell and the distant murmur of voices, as if a congregation long dead is still gathered within.
Story number 8.
The old church at the edge of town had been abandoned for decades. St. Luke's, once the heart of the community, stood in ruins, its steeple leaning precariously to one side, its windows shattered. The ivy creeping up its stone walls seemed to hold the building together as much as the crumbling mortar did. Yet for all its decay, the church held a strange allure, a pull that kept it from being forgotten entirely. Locals warned against going near it, though their reasons varied. Some spoke of strange lights in the windows at night, others of voices heard when no one was there. A few even claimed to have seen figures moving in the shadows, pale and fleeting. Still, the warnings always ended with the same words: "Just leave it alone." When Rachel first moved to town, she dismissed the stories as small-town folklore. She was a journalist, used to digging into the truth behind local legends, and St. Luke's seemed like the perfect story to investigate. She had always been fascinated by ghost stories, not because she believed in them, but because of the human need to explain the unexplainable. One crisp autumn afternoon, Rachel decided to visit the church. She brought her camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, determined to document her findings. The walk to the church was eerie, but beautiful. The path wound through a grove of oak trees, their branches bare and twisted like skeletal arms reaching toward the gray sky. The air grew colder as she approached the clearing where the church stood. The place felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself were pressing down on her. She shook off the unease and stepped through the rusted gate, her boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the door. The heavy wooden doors were slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Pushing them open, she was struck by the smell of damp earth and decay. The interior was as decrepit as the exterior. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and the altar was covered in a thick layer of dust. Above her, the rafters creaked in the faint breeze that slipped through the broken windows. Rachel began taking pictures, capturing the eerie beauty of the ruined church. The late afternoon light streamed through the shattered stained glass, casting fractured rainbows on the walls. She could almost see how the church might have looked in its prime, a place of light and hope, now reduced to shadow and silence. As she moved toward the altar, she noticed something strange. The dust on the floor was disturbed, as if someone or something had walked there recently. The marks were faint, but they led toward a side door near the pulpit. Rachel hesitated, her pulse quickening. She told herself it was probably just animals. Pushing the door open, she found a narrow staircase leading down. The air grew colder as she descended, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the stone walls. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, circular room, the crypt. The crypt was surprisingly intact. Stone coffins lined the walls, their lids carved with names and dates that had been worn away by time. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside looked untouched. Rachel's curiosity got the better of her. She reached out to open the book, but as her fingers brushed the cover, a sudden chill shot through her hand, making her gasp. She pulled back, her heart racing. It was then that she noticed the room had grown unnaturally quiet. The faint creak of the church above was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw movement in the shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The reply came as a faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. It was a single word, carried on a breath of icy air. "Leave." Rachel's blood ran cold. She backed toward the stairs, her flashlight sweeping the room. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing near one of the coffins, a tall, shadowy shape with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Panicking, she turned and ran up the stairs, her footsteps echoing loudly. When she reached the main hall, the church seemed darker, the light outside dimmer than before. She made a beeline for the door, but as she reached it, it slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the building. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tugged at the heavy doors, but they wouldn't budge. The temperature dropped further, her breath visible in the air. Behind her, she heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. She turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam caught movement. A figure standing at the far end of the nave, partially obscured by the shadows. It was dressed in what looked like a tattered robe, its face pale and featureless. "Who are you?" Rachel demanded, though her voice wavered. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move toward her, its steps unnaturally smooth, almost gliding. As it approached, the whispers returned, louder now, filling the air with overlapping voices. Rachel's instincts screamed at her to run, but the doors were still shut. Desperate, she turned toward a side window, its stained glass long since broken. She climbed through it, cutting her hand on the jagged edges but not caring. Once outside, she ran without looking back. The whispers faded as she crossed the threshold of the churchyard, but the feeling of being watched remained. She didn't stop running until she was back at her small cottage on the other side of the village. That night, Rachel tried to make sense of what had happened. She replayed the events in her mind, trying to rationalize them. The whispers could have been the wind, the shadow a trick of the light. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the memory of that figure, or the bone-deep fear it had instilled in her. She never returned to St. Luke's, and she never wrote the story she'd intended. The pictures she'd taken were blank, as though the camera had failed to capture anything at all. In the weeks that followed, Rachel learned more about the church's history from a few of the older villagers. It was said that centuries ago, a priest had been accused of dark practices, rituals that had no place in a house of God. He had been excommunicated, but not before cursing the church, vowing that it would never find peace. The villagers believed his spirit still lingered, bound to the place he had defiled. Whether or not that was true, Rachel couldn't say. All she knew was that she would never forget the chilling emptiness of the crypt, the weight of unseen eyes, and the whispered word that still haunted her dreams. Leave. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
The small, rural town of Belhaven had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. In the center of the town stood St. Augustine's Church, a towering structure of weathered stone and stained glass windows. Built in the 1800s, it had once been the pride of the town, a beacon of faith and community. But over the years, the congregation dwindled, and the church fell into disrepair. By the time I moved to Belhaven, it had been closed for nearly 2 decades. The church had a dark reputation among the locals. People claimed to hear bells ringing in the dead of night, even though the bell tower had been empty for years. Others spoke of ghostly figures seen moving past the windows, strange lights flickering inside, and whispers that carried on the wind when the surrounding streets were silent. Most people avoided the church entirely, crossing to the other side of the street rather than walking too close. I'd always been fascinated by ghost stories, though I'd never believed in them. I was a skeptic, the kind of person who needed solid evidence before I could accept something as real. When I heard about St. Augustine's, I saw an opportunity, not just for a thrill, but for a story. I was a freelance journalist, always on the lookout for a good piece, and the idea of investigating a haunted church was too good to pass up. It was late October when I decided to visit the church. The air was crisp, the sky overcast, and the wind carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming winter. I packed my bag with a flashlight, a notebook, a digital recorder, and a camera. My plan was simple: spend a few hours inside, document my experience, and see if there was any truth to the rumors. The iron gate that surrounded the churchyard was rusted and creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The graveyard was overgrown, the headstones tilted and cracked with age. As I approached the church, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The building loomed overhead, its once beautiful facade marred by years of neglect. The large wooden doors were slightly ajar, as though inviting me in. The moment I stepped inside, I was struck by the heavy silence. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. Dust motes floated in the weak beams of light that streamed through the broken stained glass windows. The pews were coated in a thick layer of dust, some of them overturned or broken. At the far end of the nave, the altar stood in shadows, its surface cracked and crumbling. I turned on my flashlight and began to explore, taking pictures and making notes. Despite the eerie atmosphere, everything seemed perfectly explainable. The wind whistling through the cracks in the stone walls accounted for the strange noises people had reported. The creaking floorboards and groaning beams were simply the sounds of an old building settling. As I moved deeper into the church, I found a staircase leading up to the bell tower. The steps were narrow and steep, and the wood groaned under my weight. At the top, the view was stunning. The town stretched out below, the rooftops glowing faintly in the pale light of the overcast sky. But the bell tower was empty, as expected. No bell, no ropes, nothing to explain the stories of nighttime tolling. I climbed back down and continued my exploration, eventually finding a door near the altar that led to the crypts below. This was where the unease I'd felt earlier intensified. The air grew colder as I descended the stone steps, the darkness pressing in around me. The beam of my flashlight flickered slightly, casting long, dancing shadows on the damp walls. The crypt was small, with rows of stone coffins lining the walls. Most were sealed, their lids carved with names and dates that had faded with time. In the center of the room stood an open coffin, its lid propped against the wall. The sight made my stomach churn. The inside was empty, but the stone was stained with something dark and unidentifiable. I set my digital recorder on a nearby ledge and began asking questions, my voice echoing softly in the confined space. "Is anyone here? Can you show yourself? Can you make a sound?" I paused, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then faintly I heard it, a soft whisper, so quiet I thought I'd imagined it. Leave. The word sent a chill down my spine. I swung my flashlight around, but the crypt was empty. My recorder was still running, Cytothere, and I told myself the whisper must have been the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. I retrieved the recorder and decided to head back upstairs. The oppressive feeling in the crypt was too much to bear. As I climbed the stairs, I heard something behind me, a soft shuffling sound like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Turning slowly, I shone my flashlight down the stairs. The beam illuminated the empty crypt, but the sound continued, growing louder. It was coming closer. I ran, stumbling up the last few steps and slamming the door shut behind me. The church above was now shrouded in an unnatural darkness, the weak light from outside barely penetrating the gloom. I fumbled with my flashlight, which flickered and dimmed as though the batteries were dying. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to regain my composure. That's when I heard the bells. The sound was deafening, echoing through the empty church with a mournful, almost angry tone. It was impossible. There was no bell in the tower, no way the sound could be real. But it was, and it was growing louder, reverberating through the walls and floor. I ran toward the door, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled or pushed, it refused to budge. Behind me, the bells continued to toll, their sound vibrating in my chest. And then, amidst the noise, I heard the whispers again. They were louder now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I turned, my back against the door, and saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They moved toward me, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces were obscured, but their hollow eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. Desperation took over, and I ran toward the nearest window, its stained glass long since broken. I climbed through, the jagged edges cutting into my hands and arms, but I didn't care. Once outside, I ran as fast as I could, the whispers and bells fading as I put distance between myself and the church. When I reached the safety of my home, I locked the doors and windows, my heart still racing. I replayed the recording from the crypt, and my blood ran cold. The whisper was there, clear as day. Leave. I never went back to St. Augustine's, and I never wrote the story I'd intended. Whatever was in that church wasn't meant to be understood or exposed. The locals were right to avoid it, and now, so was I. To this day, I can't walk past the church without feeling that same oppressive weight, that sense of being watched. St. Augustine's stands as it always has, silent and decaying, but I know better now. It isn't abandoned, something still lingers within its walls, and it wants to be left alone. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It started when the old church bells rang at midnight, long after the place had been abandoned. St. Michael's Church, situated on a lonely hill at the outskirts of our small town, hadn't been in use for nearly 30 years. Its steeple was crooked, the stained glass windows shattered, and the doors hung loosely on rusted hinges. Yet that night the bells chimed as clear as day. I was at home, brushing my teeth, when the sound drifted through my open bathroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The wind often carried strange echoes in our town, but this was unmistakably the chime of church bells. I opened the window wider, straining to listen. The deep, resonant tones echoed faintly but distinctly, sending a chill down my spine. When I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, about it the next day, she refused to meet my eyes. "Leave it be," she said curtly, her voice trembling slightly. "St. Michael's has been quiet for years. Well, best to keep it that way." Her words only piqued my curiosity. I'd always been fascinated by ghost stories, and St. Michael's had no shortage of them. Some said the pastor who built the church in the 1800s had gone mad after his wife died and that he'd hanged himself from the bell tower. Others claimed the church was cursed after a fire had killed several parishioners during a midnight mass decades ago. Whatever the story, everyone in town agreed on one thing: the church was not a place to be trifled with. By the following evening, I had made up my mind. I was going to St. Michael's to see for myself what was going on. Armed with a flashlight, my phone for recording, and a notepad, I set off up the winding path that led to the church. The night was unusually cold, and a thick fog clung to the ground, making the journey feel surreal. As I approached the church, the air seemed to grow heavier. pressing down on me with a weight I couldn't explain. The faint scent of burnt wood lingered in the air, though there hadn't been a fire in the area for years. The church loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the pale light of the moon. The broken windows gave it the appearance of hollow eyes staring down at me, and the steeple pointed skyward like a jagged finger. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, which groaned loudly on their rusted hinges. Inside, the darkness was nearly absolute, my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. The pews were covered in dust and cobwebs, some of them overturned. The altar stood in ruins, its once polished wood warped and blackened. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The air was cold and damp, and every creak of the old floorboards made my heart race. As I reached the front of the church, I noticed something strange. The bell tower's rope was frayed and hung loosely, swaying slightly even though there was no breeze. I shone my flashlight upward, following the rope's path. The beam caught something that made my breath hitch. A shadow, large and humanoid, passed across the ceiling and disappeared into the bell tower. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. It echoed eerily, but there was no response. Telling myself it was probably an animal, I made my way to the narrow staircase that led to the bell tower. The wooden steps creaked ominously under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. When I reached the top, I found the bell hanging silently, its surface tarnished with age. The space was empty, but the oppressive feeling was stronger than ever. As I turned to leave, the bell suddenly swung, releasing a single deafening chime. I stumbled back, nearly falling down the stairs. The rope hadn't moved, and there was no one else in the tower. My flashlight flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness. When the light came back on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the far end of the tower was a figure. A man dressed in a tattered black suit. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes hollow sockets that seemed to pull the light into them. He raised a hand, pointing directly at me. I turned and fled, practically throwing myself down the stairs. The air around me seemed to vibrate with whispers, low, guttural voices that I couldn't understand, but that filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. By the time I reached the main hall, the whispers had grown louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The doors, which I had left ajar, were now closed. I ran to them and pulled with all my strength, but they wouldn't budge. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing closer. I turned, my back pressed against the doors. The figure from the bell tower was there, standing in the center of the aisle. He moved toward me, his steps silent despite the creaking floorboards. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn on the camera, but the screen remained black. The figure stopped a few feet away, his hollow eyes locked on mine. The whispers subsided, replaced by a single raspy voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the entire church seemed to shift. The walls warped, the pews twisted, and the air was filled with the acrid smell of smoke and burning flesh. I could hear screams, dozens of them, overlapping and echoing in the confined space. When the lights stabilized, the figure was gone, and the doors creaked open behind me. I didn't hesitate. I ran out into the night, the whispers following me, until I crossed the threshold of the churchyard. I didn't stop running until I was home, locking every door and window before collapsing onto the couch. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with what I had just experienced. The next morning, I checked my phone. The recording I had started before entering the church was still running. I played it back, and my stomach churned as I listened. The whispers were there, growing louder and more frantic as the recording went on. And then at the very end came the raspy voice. "You shouldn't have come here." I never went back to St. Michael's, and I moved out of Belhaven a few months later. But even now, years later, I can still hear those bells in my dreams, ringing out in the dead of night. Story the end.